When you're trying to predict the exam question, it's really useful to develop a thesis statement which will fit any question. So if the one you predict isn't the one that comes up, this part still is. The thesis statement is where you lay out the author's ideas. And because Shakespeare's ideas are the same, whatever the exam question, then the thesis statement will always work. So at the heart of the play, we've got this question: who is to blame for the tragedy? Shakespeare's play is based on an earlier poem. The earlier poem by Arthur Brooke squarely blamed the teenagers, and then the nurse, and then the friar. But Shakespeare changes that, or at least allows us to consider other possibilities. We can go with Brooke's interpretation that it is the immature and lustful lover's fault, or we can say no, the prologue tells us it's the fatal loins of the family. It's the family feud. Without the feud, everything would have been hunky and dory. Or we can say no, the prologue also tells us they're star-crossed lovers. It's all fate. Or we can say no, it's all about the patriarchal control of marriage and the aggression that engenders in men and the subservience it forces on women. Or, because we're sophisticated people, we're going to say it's a mixture of those, but we think the most important is bosh, and it doesn't matter which one you pick, but weighing them up will put you automatically on grade 8 or 9. Let's see what it looks like with a question about fate. Here it is as a first paragraph. Shakespeare challenges us at the beginning with the prologue, where we discover from forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. This asks us to consider whether the teenage lovers are responsible, because the lovers are named, for their tragedy, or whether they are controlled by fate, because fate is referenced with star-crossed lovers, or dominated by patriarchal society and parental control, because it is the fatal loins of the parents that cause it. This makes it a beyond grade 9 thesis statement which you can steal and drop into any single essay, just adding the keyword that's relevant to the question, because we're talking about conflict and fate. It's fate that I reference here. Now, if you would like several grade 9 versions of the essay that this belongs with, they are in the link in the description. Let's see what quotes I would use to write this essay. Do not panic at the number of quotations on the board. I have highlighted in blue the keywords that are going to be relevant and necessary to commit to memory. All the other stuff is bonus. I am going to move in a chronological order through the play because that's the easiest way to develop an argument, and when you're developing an argument, you're automatically at least at grade 7. Now, you do not have to follow this structure. You can simply start with the extract. That's what the exam paper tells you to do, but that's an instruction to help students who have done 0 revision. The idea is that, okay, you're only going to get a grade 2 or a 3 or even a 1. Well, we've got to give you some quotes because you won't have learned anything. Here they are in the extract. Crack on, get some quotes, get some marks. But if you start with the extract, it's really hard to write an argument. If you still want to do that, how would you use my video? Like this. You'd start with the extract and then think, okay, what happened before that I can write about? And then what happened after that I can write about? And in that way, you'll show how the idea, in this case, fate and conflict, how that develops during the play. It's not as easy as going through chronologically, but it will work if you have the chutzpah to keep going backwards, then to the extract, forwards, back to the extract. Here we go. I will push Montague's men from the wall and thrust his maids to the wall. Why does Shakespeare start this love story with two blokes, Samson and Gregory, having adolescent banter about sexual abuse. The audience, they think it's hilarious. They're laughing away. And Shakespeare's point is, hey guys, we live in a patriarchal society that thinks nothing of violence towards men, push the Montague men to the wall, but this thinking about violence is even worse when we think about what's going to happen to women. They are going to be thrust to the wall. This is very violent imagery. Yes, of course, it is sexual, and that's the kind of thrust that he's talking about. But Shakespeare's point here is that the male attraction to violence, which we will see play out in the duel, is exactly the same as their violent attitudes towards women. And Shakespeare's point is, that's the problem in our society, people. If we treated women more as independent and autonomous people, then tragedies wouldn't happen. And therefore, in answer to our question, is it fate that's controlling the lovers? No. The opening suggests it's much more patriarchal society and the attitude of men controlling women. We'll see how that develops. Samson says, "My naked weapon is out." He is, of course, referring to his sword. But we all understand the double entendre. It's not just his sword that is naked. In other words, he's making fun of sexual violence towards women again. Ha ha, it is very funny. But the underlying message that Shakespeare is giving us is, what kind of society is it that finds violence against women a subject of humour in this way? Then we are introduced to Romeo, the great lover of this text, the man or the young man who's going to be so in love with Juliet. Again, Shakespeare presents in the beginning a completely different view of masculinity. Romeo claims that he's in love with Rosaline, but how does he demonstrate that love? He tries to bribe her with gold into opening her lap, into having sex with him. One way of looking at this is to say, well, he's just completely immature. He's acting as though he knows what love is, but actually he doesn't. It's just sex. But then another deeper level is, well, how on earth is someone like Romeo going to have sex? How is Rosaline going to have sex? They can't unless they're married. And that is patriarchal control. Why do women have to be virgins until they're married? So that the father can take their daughter and present them as pristine objects untouched by any other man to increase their sales value to match them to a richer husband. Women treated as commodities. And so this whole idea of how men control women is at the root of the tragedy of the play. Romeo is both immature and an example of how patriarchal control damages relationships between men and women. When Romeo goes to the Capulet ball, Benvolio says, "Come on, I'll show you loads of other beauties. You can forget Rosaline." Romeo doesn't want to go. He's had this premonition, a dream, and he says some consequence yet hanging in the stars shall begin with this night's revels. He knows there will be a tragedy if he goes, but he goes anyway. So, is that fate? Well, not really, because fate has warned him, and yet he's ignored the warning that fate gives. So now we start to blame the lovers again. At least Romeo, he's acting immaturely. We saw that with the bribery for sex. Now we see it with ignoring the consequences of his own fears. Then we have the other aspect of masculinity, Capulet. At the beginning, Capulet is a different sort of father to the one he is at the end. At the beginning, he says to Paris, "Let 2 more summers wither in their pride, ere we may think her ripe to be a bride." But 2 more summers is much more reasonable. Juliet will be far more mature at 16 than she is at 14. We would still consider that young, and by the way, Shakespeare's audience would still consider that young, but he's writing about the Italians in Verona. However, I should have underlined this word ripe, because that's the other side of patriarchal control. He's describing his daughter as a fruit that will be ripe in 2 years' time. This again presents her as a commodity, something to be bought and sold and enjoyed. The fruit is there to be enjoyed by Paris. Then we have the fateful meeting of the two lovers at the ball. Juliet observes, "My only love sprung from my only hate." One way of interpreting that is the tragedy is caused by fate that's brought these two people, the very two people who should never meet, together. But we remember that Romeo chose to go to the party. So is it fate? And also, why is Juliet attracted to Romeo? Is it because he is from the other family? Is she attracted to rebelling against her parents? Another clue, Rosaline, also a Capulet. Romeo attracted to the very family his parents have forbidden him for having any relationship with. And so again we see teenage rebellion, immaturity, they are the problem. Or are the parents the problem for setting up this prohibition, this feud between the two families? I'm not going to give you the answer. Shakespeare isn't going to give you the answer, but you're going to get the grade 9 or the 8 or the 7 by considering which way you want to go with the evidence that you use. Another example of the lovers' immaturity is the religious language they use in this sonnet that they share when they speak to each other while they're dancing. The sonnet, of course, is a love poem. They share each other's lines and rhymes. It shows how beautifully matched they are together and how pure their love is. Well, that's one interpretation. But look at the conceit, the image that goes all the way through it, and that is of Juliet being a saint and Romeo being a pilgrim. So basically they take the language of Christianity and they apply it to lust and sex. That is quite sacrilegious. It's not what you'd expect with religious language. And so we can use that as a sign of their transgression. They're breaking taboos. They're saying things and doing things which they shouldn't because they are young and impulsive. Romeo is so impulsive that he wants to be satisfied. So when he's having the conversation with Juliet on her balcony after the party, he complains, "Oh, wilt thou leave me so unsatisfied?" And Juliet thinks, "I know what you're after, sunshine. It's the same thing you were after when you were bribing Rosaline. And luckily, there is a balcony between you and me." And she's saying, "Well, what satisfaction canst thou have tonight?" She takes his words entirely to be about sex. He then says, "Oh, no, I didn't mean sex at all. I wanted to exchange vows with you, and the vows not just of love." Juliet says, "Well, if you want to talk about vows, let's talk marriage." So this evidence that she encourages the marriage straight away obviously shows the lovers are impulsive and immature. But we can look at it another way. It says, well, if you were in love with each other, the only way for this society to allow you to get together is by forcing you to marry. And so the problem isn't that they're impulsive. The problem is they've got nowhere to go except marriage. Patriarchal society has controlled them in this way. Which do you favour? Do you think it's patriarchal society that's at fault, or do you think the lovers are at fault? You decide. Then they go to the friar. So the friar is also to blame because he can just say, "No, I'm not going to marry you," and then there's no marriage, there's no tragedy. problem sorted. But the friar doesn't. He says, I will marry you. He says, in one respect, I'll thy assistant be. In other words, I can see a dozen reasons why this marriage is wrong, but there is one thing, just one thing, and that thing is so massive that I'm going to do it. And the massive thing is, I'm going to turn your household's rancor into pure love. And so the friar's thinking, well, I'm going to bring peace, not just to the families, but to the whole of Verona. This is what God has put me on earth to do, must be his internal thinking. Of course, this is deeply flawed because he's going against both sets of parents. So he's taking a massive risk with these immature teenagers in the hope that it might lead to the feud stopping. But remember the prologue. The prologue tells us it's God's plan for the death of the lovers to stop the feud. And so another way of looking at the friar is he is a victim of fate, a victim of God, or if you like, an instrument, because he has to marry them in order for God's plan to kill the lovers through them taking their life. For that plan to work, they've got to be married. So you can criticise the friar for his ridiculous idea, or you can say, oh, maybe God has manipulated him, fate has manipulated him, and he's the instrument of fate. You decide. To help make you decide, Shakespeare has a bit of a laugh. So the friar says to Romeo, wisely and slow, they stumble that run fast. He's having a joke at Romeo for rushing to marry Juliet so that he can have sex with her. But those words, they stumble that run fast, exactly apply to the friar. The friar is rushing. He could say, yep, I'll marry you. Let's see how you feel in 2 months' time. Is it still genuine? But no. He goes, no, I'll marry you. Let's do it today. Ridiculous rush. A terrible decision. So is he forced into this by some supernatural impact from fate or God, or is it his own stupidity? This is bonus beyond grade 9 for you, but what the hell, I love teaching. Shakespeare is writing at a time when Catholics are not allowed to worship in public. Verona is in Italy. Italy, Catholic. The friar, Catholic. So Shakespeare is portraying the friar as wrong in thinking, also because the friar is Catholic. It's a bit of propaganda to say, thank God old Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth's dad, got rid of the Catholic faith. Now we come to the tragedy proper. So Romeo, in true tradition of the tragic hero, tries to avoid his fate. He will not fight Tybalt. But that act brings his fate about, just what happens to every tragic hero. That act makes Mercutio stand in for Romeo and decide to fight Tybalt. Let's look at his language. He says, O calm, dishonourable, vile, submission. So now we come back to the patriarchal society. Mercutio is desperate to fight because fighting is a sign of honour. Submission is a sign of dishonour and weakness. In other words, these men in the patriarchal society are told that strength is king, that reputation is king, and the way to establish your strength and reputation is to kill other people in duels. So the whole problem with society here is the power it gives to young men to make stupid decisions. They're all armed. They're allowed to go around with their swords. It's going to lead to trouble, says Shakespeare. And it's no surprise when it does. So the blame here, it's not fate, it's not Romeo and Juliet. The blame could be patriarchal society. And obviously, Montague and Capulet have been encouraging this violence through the 3 civil brawls that we've had prior, says the prince. That's why he's threatening everyone with execution. We then get Tybalt killing Mercutio. And so Mercutio rightly blames Romeo. I had everything under control. Now I'm dying because of you. A plague on both your houses. This, of course, is a curse, but it is also fate, because when Juliet takes her potion that makes her look dead for 42 hours, what does the friar do? He sends a messenger to Romeo to say, she just looks dead, it's not real, don't worry. But the messenger can't get through because there is a plague. There's been a case of plague, so the gates to the city have been shut, the messenger cannot get out. And so both houses, Romeo and Juliet, are destroyed by a plague. Mercutio's curse comes to pass. Is that irony? Or is it fate acting against the two lovers? You decide. Okay, Mercutio's dead, but that doesn't have to be the tragic ending. If Romeo had left it at that, the friar's plan could still have worked. What changes it is Romeo decides to kill Tybalt. So why does he decide to kill Tybalt? He blames Juliet. He says, "Thy beauty hath made me effeminate. You have turned me into a woman." Because this is a patriarchal society, being a woman is an insult. You couldn't lower a man's status further than by making him effeminate. And so, in order to become a proper masculine man again, he feels he's actually got to kill Tybalt. Yes, that shows us his immaturity, but it also shows us the attitude of patriarchal society towards women. It's also not very loving towards Juliet. The moment something goes wrong, he blames his wife. How typical is that? I hope not very typical. Now, this bit is quite typical. Once he's killed Tybalt, he says, "Oh, I am fortune's fool." Fortune is fate. Yet he thinks, fate has decided that I am going to be a victim. There's nothing I could do about it. It's not my fault. It was fate. Well, of course it's his fault. He had that decision. He chose not to kill Tybalt, and then he changed his mind. Well, it's totally his decision. So again, we've got the sign of his immaturity, or, if you prefer, no, he really is fate's fool. Fate has played with him, and he has now caused a tragedy by killing Tybalt. The death of Tybalt brings about Capulet's plan to marry his daughter to Paris. Remember, Juliet is weeping all the time. Well, obviously she's weeping because her husband has killed her cousin, but the Capulets don't know that. They think she's just crying because her cousin is dead, and Capulet thinks, well, I've lost one ally, Tybalt, I need another one, Paris. Paris is a count, like he is superior in the social order. He's related to the prince. So if Juliet marries the count, then the Capulet family is going to be way more powerful than the Montague family. Result. Plus, Juliet is clearly distressed, so he does what any good father would do in a patriarchal society. He says, look, I've got Paris, he's handsome, he's young, he's got this huge status as a count, he's super wealthy. There you go, Juliet. What an awesome father I am. In terms of the play, Capulet's being a great dad. And then he can't understand why Juliet loses it and says, there's no way I'm going to marry Paris. Whose fault is that? Well, it's Juliet's fault, isn't it, for marrying Romeo in private? Or, no, it's the friar's fault for marrying them in private. Or no, it's fate that has manoeuvred them all together so that this marriage in private would happen, and then Capulet's going to react with this violence, hang, beg, starve, die in the streets. The violence of this, remember there's no evidence that he hits her, despite saying my fingers itch. He just wants to, he doesn't actually hit her. But the violence of this threat is so powerful because it's a patriarchal society. Without her father's backing, Juliet's got nothing. She's got no money, she's obviously got no trade, she's got no skills. So this forces her into the extreme measures of either killing herself or marrying and then going to hell because she's already married and God won't accept a bigamous relationship. But let's look next at his other language. He says to her, fettle your fine joints. To fettle is to shape the clay that you're working with as a potter. And there would be joints if, let's say, I had a handle on here and this was a massive pint mug and I was going to drink cacti for the rest of my life. So to fettle your fine joints, nice image of a potter, but it's also deeply sexual. It's telling Juliet, look, your joints are the ones that your husband is going to want to enjoy. And you've got to make them presentable to him. You've got to fettle them. So deeply offensive sexual language, but also telling her again, you are just a commodity. You are just something that I can give to my friend in return for status. Shakespeare is therefore deeply critical of the patriarchal control of women because it's that leads to the tragedy. If Capulet didn't insist on the marriage to Paris, then there would be no need for Juliet to threaten to kill herself. There would have been no potion. There would have been no news that Romeo had got that Juliet was dead. Everything would have been hunky and dory. Capulet, the patriarchal society, that's what's to blame. Or is it the immaturity of the lovers? So Juliet goes to the friar and says to him, be not so long to speak, I long to die. She's threatening to kill herself. Romeo also threatened to kill himself when he was with the friar. It's the immaturity of the lovers. It's not Capulet. It's not patriarchal society. It's not fate. You can see how we're constantly torn between these different ideas. That's what's going to make your essay brilliant because you're going to decide which interpretation you prefer. Romeo thinks it's fate. When he hears that Juliet is dead, he decides that he is going to attack fate by killing himself. Remember that he looked at the consequence yet hanging in the stars and he thinks, oh, that consequence is now Juliet's death. I thought it was Tybalt's death when I was Fortune's fool, but now I see that fate was really after killing Juliet all along. Well, I am going to defeat fate by also killing myself. Another violent solution, which leads us to masculinity, but also a deeply immature solution, which leads us towards the immaturity of the lovers. But it's also exactly what fate wants. Maybe he's being manipulated. Fate has encouraged them to have this love which is so all-encompassing that life is meaningless without it. Obviously, I don't believe that, but Shakespeare might. I don't know. But what matters is what you believe. When Romeo dies by taking poison, he wants to kiss Juliet. And so he says, thus, with a kiss, I die. He's immature. He associates the committing of suicide with the idea of a sexual union with his wife. How else do we know that? The word die in Shakespeare's time meant to have an orgasm. And so he's clearly using language which presents his own suicide as a sexual reunion with Juliet. We also know that he's thinking sexually because he calls Juliet a paramour to death. He's imagining that death is now going to have his wife as a lover, and so he'd rather kill himself so that he, in death, will have his wife as a lover, and death personified, the guy in the black cloak and the scythe and what have you, he's not going to be able to enjoy Juliet's company because Romeo will be there. He dies because of sexual jealousy. Bizarre. But Juliet also picks up on the idea. She kills herself with Romeo's dagger. Remember, my naked weapon is out. We already associate the pointy object with the penis. It's symbolised, and she uses the same sort of sexual imagery. So a sheath isn't just what the dagger fits into. A sheath is also Elizabethan Shakespearean speak for the woman's vagina. The language she uses is about introducing the dagger into herself sexually. She too is seeing the death as a sexual union. Why would Shakespeare end this great tragedy with these sexual puns? Because he's pointing out the violence against women that we started with is the same violence against women that we ended with. The idea of the women being objects of male power is portrayed at the end. Juliet embraces the idea of being an object of male power and uses the symbol of that male power to kill herself. It's deeply troubling, isn't it? And so, is this a criticism of patriarchal society, or is it a criticism of the lovers for confusing love and lust and being immature and impulsive? You know what I'm going to say? You decide. Then we get the resolution. This is what the prince says. Heaven finds means to kill your joys with love. This brings us back to fate again. Heaven is God, the instrument of fate, or if you like, the controller of fate. And God has decided that the only way to restore love, to get the families together again, to restore peace to Verona, is to have the lovers take their lives. God's plan. Anything that anybody did doing here wouldn't have made any difference. God would have still brought it about this way. You can decide to look at it that way if you want. Or we could look at this as no. God is punishing the parents for their feud. It's the parents' fault. And that is why the children have been sacrificed, because of the parents' sins. You decide. This is what happens next. Montague, Romeo's dad, says, I will raise her statue in pure gold. He's going to not only stop the feud, he's going to have a golden statue of Juliet. But this is patriarchal control again, isn't it? The statue reminds us of how women are controlled and bought and sold and treated as commodities. And so we could use that image to say, ultimately, Shakespeare has looked at all the different culprits and he's decided patriarchal society. That is the true cause of the tragedy. Well, that's the one I'm plumping for, but you can plump for whichever one you like. If you would like to see how these quotes make a grade 9 essay, it's in the link in the description. Or if you would like a free essay to revise from, well, that is the video coming up now.